You've been flat out lied to by Hollywood. And probably your high school geography teacher, too. Everyone acts like sailors before GPS were clueless idiots, gambling with death over open seas. The lie? Ancient mariners just drifted aimlessly, blind to direction, hoping wind and luck would save them. Thanks to blockbusters. Yes, Pirates of the Caribbean. We're looking at you. We picture Greeks and Vikings staring hopelessly at endless horizons. But here's your reality check. Polynesian navigators in the first millennium dominated the Pacific using complex star maps memorized by heart, documented by anthropologist David Lewis in the 20th century when interviewing the last surviving master sailors. Mediterranean captains? The 15th century Venetian manual, Il Compasso da Navigare, proves they steered by sun position, star constellations, and even subtle changes in watercolor, centuries before compasses became standard gear. Vikings cracked the code with sunstones, crystals unearthed in a 2002 shipwreck that pinpointed the sun through clouds. You panic when your phone dies. They thrived without digital crutches every single day. Still worship your GPS? Ancient mariners had cosmic Wi-Fi and never dropped the connection once. If you believed movies over history, it's time to rethink everything. Without advanced navigation like GPS, many believed sea travel was straightforward because the world was perceived as flat. Hollywood lied. Ancient sailors never bought the flat earth nonsense, and sea travel wasn't simple because of it. If you believe terrified medieval mariners refused to sail far for fear of falling off the edge, blame 19th century mythmaker Washington Irving. Yep, the same guy who fabricated most of Columbus's backstory also invented the scared of the edge myth that fuels today's movies. Here's the real deal. As early as the 6th century BCE, Greek philosopher Pythagoras proved the earth was round. By the 3rd century BCE, Eratosthenes nailed Earth's circumference with shadows and math. No pancake planet here. Venetian sailing manuals from the 15th century reveal ships disappearing hull first over the horizon. An undeniable curved Earth clue. The 2,000-year-old Antikythera mechanism, found in a shipwreck, demands spherical Earth knowledge to work. So if you swallowed the flat Earth fairy tale, congrats! You're rocking the same outdated science as a conspiracy-loving Reddit keyboard warrior. Believing in a flat world, sailors often relied merely on the hope that the wind would carry them safely. You've been straight up lied to by lazy Hollywood hacks and dull history textbooks. The biggest myth? That ancient sailors just drifted aimlessly, begging the wind for mercy. If you bought that, think again. Thanks to garbage like Pirates of the Caribbean and clueless educational shows, most folks imagine old mariners as clueless gamblers rolling dice with Poseidon every trip. Schoolbooks paint them as primitive. How insulting is that? Here's the truth bomb. Indian Ocean sailors in the 1st century AD tracked monsoon winds so precisely they recorded them in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. Jump ahead to the 1100s, and 12th century navigator Ahmad ibn Majid crafted detailed sea guides relying on currents, stars, and science. Not blind luck. Archaeologists digging in 1990s Greece uncovered lid sounding stones, ancient GPS devices. Meanwhile, most weekend sailors today couldn't find north on a sunny afternoon, but 15th century Polynesians navigated vast oceans with homemade stick charts better than some modern captains. Still think these captains were just lucky? Hollywood treats navigation like hitting shuffle on Spotify. But ancient mariners were basically Google Maps in togas, masters of a high-tech art centuries ahead of their time. This reliance on chance underscored their deep fear of the uncharted and mysterious oceans. You've been fed a lie by Victorian authors. Sailors weren't terrified wimps cowering on creaky decks. They were the original adrenaline junkies. Hollywood and those gloomy 19th century novelists twisted the high seas into therapy sessions for anxious men. If you believed sailors dreaded the unknown, frozen with fear every time the ocean swallowed the horizon, think again. Here's the truth. 15th century Portuguese navigators deliberately chased danger, targeting places scrawled as "Here be monsters" on their maps. Check the Livro de Marinharia from 1509. It's full of thrill-seeking log entries, not panic. Viking runestones from the 10th and 11th centuries? They read like bragging rights, not horror stories. One went there, you didn't. And Polynesian canoe remains, unearthed on remote Pacific islands and documented by National Geographic in 2008, prove these sailors weren't hiding. They were hunting horizons. So if you're scared of the dark, don't compare yourself to a Portuguese sea captain, unless you also panic at roller coasters and haunted houses. Their fears were compounded by the fact that ancient ships were small and ill-suited for long voyages. You've been royally lied to by textbooks and cheesy adventure flicks. Ancient ships were not fragile bathtubs hugging the shore. Blame Victorian armchair historians like 19th century scholars for branding Vikings as muddy oar slaves, terrified of open waters. Most still imagine Viking longships as splintery toothpicks barely escaping fjords. Hollywood desperately pushes that watery nonsense. But here's solid, carved proof. The Gokstad ship, dug up in Norway in 1880 and built in the 9th century, stretches over 23 meters with a monstrous, sea-crushing hull. Norse sagas and 13th century chronicles boast bold Atlantic crossings to Greenland and even Canada, centuries before Columbus awkwardly posed for his history-making selfie. Need an ironclad fact? Viking artifacts at 50 Aunts O Meadows, Newfoundland, discovered in the 1960s, confirm they literally landed in North America. So if you believed Viking ships weren't ocean-worthy, congrats, you've been duped by a Victorian myth. The Vikings were basically the Teslas of medieval sea travel, while Hollywood's still stuck in horse and buggy mode. Due to their limited size and capability, navigators often found themselves drifting with currents rather than steering confidently. You've been royally lied to by textbook illustrations and outdated documentaries. The cruel myth that Polynesian navigators just drifted aimlessly wherever the waves pushed them. Blame 19th century Victorian explorer snobbery and lazy Hollywood cliches. They deliberately turned Pacific pioneers into clueless tourists with no map. We're fed this nonsense that early Polynesians were helpless at sea, like lost castaways wandering wherever. Sound familiar? Thank backward 1800s European historians who refused to accept Pacific Islanders, mastered complex navigation, plus every low-budget school film with a sad ukulele and a flimsy rubber raft. But here's your jaw-dropper. 1,000-year-old Lapita pottery shards, meticulously tracked in detailed archaeological layers across the Pacific, prove deliberate, precisely controlled migration. The 1976 Hokulea voyage from Hawaii to Tahiti, using only ancient wayfinding techniques, demolished the dumb luck myth once and for all. Even Captain James Cook's 18th century logs rave about Tahitian wayfinders steering by stars, ocean swells, and birds with precision. Still buying the lost tourist story? Congrats, Hollywood's officially bamboozled you. Believing this is like claiming astronauts just hit random and stumbled onto the moon, or that Tom Hanks really survived on a volleyball island by accident. Consequently, many sailors stuck close to coastlines to avoid the dangers of the open sea. You've been sold the biggest lie about ancient sailors. Hollywood and Victorian historians painted them as terrified of the open sea. If you believe these explorers just clung to coastlines like scared kids, think again. Pop culture and 19th century textbooks turned Mediterranean mariners into cowardly beachcombers, as if they were just out for a picnic by the shore. The truth? Phoenician records like the 5th century BCE Periplus of Hanno actually map daring voyages deep into the Atlantic, far beyond any sight of land. Greek geographer Pytheas in the 4th century BCE famously sailed from the Mediterranean all the way to Britain, so scratch the image of shallow water waders, his journey was later documented by Roman historians. Archaeologists uncovered the 5th century BCE Mazaran II shipwreck off Spain, built tough enough for brutal ocean crossings, not cowering near rocks. These coastal cowards rode bigger waves than most modern yacht bros flexing on Instagram. Still thinking ancient sailors panicked at every wave? Congrats! Your mental map is stuck in Victorian fantasy, not reality. Yet, even near shore, storms frequently brought ancient journeys to abrupt and disastrous ends. You've been fed a Hollywood lie! Disaster blockbusters push the idea that every ancient voyage ended in Poseidon-level shipwrecks. But here's the truth. Real ancient mariners outsmarted storms far more often than they sank. Everyone assumes old-school sailors were doomed the second a cloud appeared, victims in history's first Titanic rerun. Thanks, movies like 300 Hours and Troy for turning every boat trip into a death drama at sea. Reality check. Ancient sailors weren't clueless. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, 1st century CE, explicitly advises setting sail with the monsoon seasons. They tracked weather centuries before apps existed. Polybius, the 2nd century BCE Greek historian, praised fleets that used sharp tactics to dodge storms, not panicked flailing. The Kyrenia shipwreck, 4th century BCE, proves ships completed long, stormy journeys and survived. If you thought ancient sailors jumped ship at the first drizzle, congrats. You swallowed Poseidon's press release whole. It's like believing every airplane takes a nosedive because of a little turbulence. The lack of reliable maps or charts made it difficult to prepare for and survive such storms. You've been fed a blatant lie by smug Victorian scholars. Ancient people couldn't read maps because, obviously, they didn't have any. But what if one told you the ancients had cartography that would make your high school geography teacher weep? Hollywood loves selling the myth that before the so-called Age of Discovery, humanity just aimlessly wandered, terrified of falling off the edge of the earth. That ridiculous fantasy was crafted by 19th century academics who dismissed ancient maps as childish scribbles while sipping their afternoon tea and patting themselves on the back. Here's the real shocker. The Piri Reis map from 1513, created by an Ottoman admiral, brilliantly compiles ancient sources and accurately outlines South America. You can see this masterpiece yourself at Istanbul's Topkapi Palace. Or consider Claudius Ptolemy's Geographia, penned in the 2nd century CE, over 8,000 precise locations mapped with coordinates, centuries before anyone could even dream of Google Maps. Don't forget the British Museum's 6th century BCE Babylonian clay map, featuring detailed rivers and terrain. Still cling to the myth that the ancients were clueless? Try navigating Google Maps with zero signal, and then crawl back to give Piri Reis the respect he deserves. It's like expecting modern pilots to fly without GPS, yet trusting 2,000-year-old mariners to be lost at sea. Compounding this challenge, the navigation tools available were extremely primitive by modern standards. You've been conned by Hollywood's lie that ancient sailors drifted lost at sea, armed with nothing but vibes and prayers. If you believe this, you've bought into the hopeless sailors scam Hollywood has been feeding us for decades. Movies and early 20th century adventure novels deliberately painted medieval and Eastern sailors as clueless extras, waiting for a heroic Western compass-wielding breakthrough. That's pure fiction. Here's the truth. Arabian navigators used the kamal, a precision latitude tool, as early as the 9th century, expertly described by the 15th century navigator Ibn Majid. Astrolabes, refined to near mathematical perfection during the 8th–14th century Islamic Golden Age, have been unearthed across Spanish digs and Persian treasure sites. And Shen Kuo documented Chinese magnetic compasses in 1088, centuries before Europe caught up. If you think these ancient tools were some primitive junk, try using Apple Maps in a tunnel. Suddenly, all that tech from a millennium ago looks like the real MVPs, not some Hollywood pirate's magic trick. With such limitations, crossing the vast and open ocean seemed an insurmountable obstacle. Hollywood and stodgy Victorian historians have brainwashed you. They claim ancient humans stared at the ocean like deer in headlights, too scared or clueless to cross it. If you believe that, think again. Ancient people were far better world travelers than half your Instagram feed. The myth? That open oceans were unbreachable walls, requiring modern ships or GPS just to leave an island. Blame 19th century textbook writers and every cheesy movie showing primitive folks stranded and helpless. But archaeology smashes that lie. Lapita pottery fragments from the 14th century BCE litter over 2,500 miles of Pacific islands. Even more damning, in the 1990s, Talepa Kemalai digs in Papua New Guinea uncovered Lapita artifacts proving real stepwise migration. If ancient Polynesians had frequent flyer miles, they'd be platinum long before you even left your couch. Still think ancient humans just stayed put? The real joke's on you. Compared to them, your vacation planning is prehistoric. Furthermore, many sailors were illiterate and unable to keep written records that might aid navigation. You've been straight up lied to by Hollywood and crusty old textbooks. That tired myth about ancient sailors as illiterate brutes lost at sea? If you believe that, you've swallowed pirate movies and stiff 19th century Victorian historians' propaganda, who glamorized noble officers while dumbing down everyone else. Think about it. People assumed deckhands could barely grunt, let alone read, because some British Navy fanboy in the 1800s wanted to boost the officer's image. But open a genuine 15th century Venetian logbook, like Captain Alvise de Mosto's diary from the 1450s, and you'll find lyrical weather reports, poems, and sharp inventories. Step back further. 7th century BCE Near Eastern clay tablets recorded ship logs, payments, and cargo. Ancient Excel sheets long before the Age of Sail. Even Greek sailors penned sea prayers in the Orphic hymns, 3rd century BCE. So if you thought sailors didn't write, congratulations. You just fell for history's cruelest game of telephone. And honestly, those guys had better handwriting than half the influencers flooding your feed today. This lack of knowledge made sailors particularly susceptible to fears of mythical sea monsters that deterred them from venturing far. You've been straight up lied to by Hollywood and every late-night ancient sea monster documentary. Those cheesy CGI tentacles duped you into believing sailors were terrified babies who'd rather hide in port than face a colossal squid. The brutal truth? Old-time mariners 999 not cower below deck, paralyzed by krakens, leviathans, or whatever Spielberg hallucinated after his third espresso. Victorian authors and so-called scientific illustrators in the 19th century shamelessly recycled medieval bestiary monsters onto fragile maps and exaggerated logbook doodles to sell sensational stories. Here's the reality check. Dig into any 16th to 18th century shiplog, like William Dampier's 1697 journal, and you'll find complaints about soggy biscuits and fierce storms, not freakish sea beasts. Olaus Magnus's 1539 Carta Marina features monstrous figures, but they're warnings for treacherous waters, not proof of sailor hysteria. And those Vasa-ship letters from 1628, full of panic over weather, not tentacles. If you believed sailors' caution was kraken terror, guess what? You swallowed a Victorian fairy tale whole. Next time Netflix buffers, try to stay calm, and maybe rethink where you get your history. It's as absurd as fearing a giant squid attack while ordering pizza delivery. As a result, ancient trade remained small-scale and localized rather than expansive across oceans. You've been fed a rotten lie. That ancient trade was just farmers swapping carrots at dusty village stalls. Blame Victorian historians and stale high school textbooks for this myth. They shoved a world where merchants barely left their hometowns, pushing carts of onions next door. But they ignored mountains of proof and literal receipts. French archaeologists in the 20th century exploded this lie when they uncovered the 1st century Madrague de Gien shipwreck. It wasn't a local trader. It was a floating Costco, packed with thousands of amphorae loaded with wine, olive oil, and garum shipped all the way from Spain, North Africa, and the Black Sea. Even crazier, the 1st century Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, an ancient Roman maritime guide, bragged about Roman ships docking from India to Arabia and Africa, showing a global shipping empire centuries before Columbus. And if you still believe ancient trade was local only, check out the hundreds of Roman coins unearthed in Vietnam during 1980s excavations. Proof Romans reached farther than you ever imagined. If you swallowed the History Channel's recycled nonsense, wake up! Compared to these ancient traders, your Amazon Prime delivery is stuck in the Middle Ages. This conservative maritime culture was further reflected in societal norms, such as the exclusive participation of men in sailing. You've been sold a Hollywood-sized lie. Ancient ships weren't all boys-only clubs. Thank outdated Victorian textbooks and blockbuster movies for rewriting maritime history into a beard fest with 0 female captains. If you believed seafaring was a no-girls-allowed zone, think again. Victorian scholars and 20th century adventure flicks erased centuries of hardcore women who ruled the waves. Need proof? The 13th century Norse Hervarar saga, Oke Hydrex, tells of Alfhild, a shield maiden who captained pirate ships without breaking a sweat. Southeast Asian chronicles from the 10th to 13th centuries spotlight Sriwijaya sea queens commanding huge trading fleets. And here's the mic drop. 2017 DNA tests on a Burqa warrior's burial, decked out with weapons and a ship, confirmed the legendary Viking captain was female. If you pictured pirates as just Jack Sparrow and his bros, guess what? Even ancient longships had more gender diversity than your office happy hour or a Marvel movie cast. Over time, much of the maritime knowledge and technology from ancient times was lost and had to be rediscovered centuries later in Europe. You've been duped by a massive Eurocentric cover-up. Victorian-era historians and Hollywood epics flat out lied, pushing the myth that old sailing was a dead art until Europeans heroically resurrected it. If you believed global navigation was a lost secret magically revived by 15th and 16th century Portuguese and Spanish explorers, think again. This is a swashbuckling reboot rewriting history with familiar, square-jawed white heroes front and center. Blame 19th century British historians and their blockbuster films, where white men squint at compasses while everyone else supposedly flails hopelessly at sea. Here's the brutal reality. As early as the 9th century, Arab navigators mastered the Kamal to read stars and penned detailed navigation manuals. Ahmad ibn Majid's 15th century treatise literally guided Vasco da Gama across the Indian Ocean. The Chinese treasure fleets led by Zheng He sailed the Indian Ocean in the early 1400s, using magnetic compasses and preserved charts centuries before Europeans got credit. Polynesians crossed the vast Pacific by reading wave patterns, a fact proved by the 1990s Hokulea expedition. If you swallowed the Euro savior lie, congrats! You've just been catfished by a 19th century British librarian. Europe claiming they discovered sailing is like someone buying a GPS and bragging they invented Google Maps. Wake up and question the story they sold you.